I'm sure at some point you've come across a cool album cover, decided to click play, and been greeted with somebody who more than likely looks like this, screaming and wailing at an obnoxious volume. Perhaps you've been insulted or more likely relentlessly bullied by the chads at school for listening to this kind of music, the music equivalent of cats fighting in the garden. You may have thought to yourself, why do people do this? Where did all this screaming originally come from? And most importantly, why do I subject myself to this? Well, it's your lucky day, because I'm going to attempt to answer 2 of those questions. The third one you're going to have to figure out on your own, so good luck. I think in order to understand screaming within music, we first need to understand why we scream in the first place. The first evolutionary need for screaming is primarily thought to be a way to startle predators, like this video. As living as a human being has become progressively easier, without any predators apart from that previously mentioned bully, the purpose of the scream has diversified a little bit. Excitement, aggression, pain, you name it. This has led to a scream more often than not being linked to some sort of emotion, which is what links it to music. We honestly aren't very aware of where screaming and music first linked. Pretentious intellectuals may tell you that it was some sort of tribal music, maybe a Viking war cry before they go into a rant about pointless history for 40 minutes. My theory? Surely one of our ancestors rhythmically smashed a rock against a tree while screaming. We had millions of years of to do, meaning scientifically it had to happen at some point. Here is my audio representation of that moment. Moving swiftly along, Viking war cries have actually been described more so as a screech, more akin to what black metal vocalists would do nowadays, which makes sense considering half these motherfuckers wish they were reborn as Vikings, while simultaneously having zero muscle on their frame. Similarly to real life, screaming within music has primarily been for emotional context. It helps the listener understand how the artist is feeling and what they want to put across in the particular piece of music. This is highlighted in the majority of historical accounts of screaming in music, because apparently historians have actually studied this. 11th century play Ordo Vituritum features the devil as a character. Although the stage directions haven't been confirmed, it's widely agreed upon that the lines were delivered through yells, screeches and shouts. This is all just history though, we can't actually hear anything. When was screaming in music first actually recorded? Ironically, it's directly linked to Christianity, with what pastors refer to as shouting. It's basically when preachers get extremely excited about God and sound like this.
Get on board. Some of you been to see one another ever since you've been a while.
This ended up inspiring early gospel musicians to use the same technique in their music. Although technically a form of screaming, it wasn't overly aggressive. This aggressiveness wouldn't rear its head until blues artist Little Richard, and more appropriately named Screaming Jay Hawkins, would put out some songs with vocals that weren't only harsh, but also really funny. Although these motherfuckers were basically screaming, it's more so considered powerful singing and doesn't really resemble the style of screaming that will become popular in the next 50 years. A song that very much resembles the modern sound of primarily death metal screaming is Boris the Spider by The Who, which utilises a growl, sounding very similar to this except more British. We could go on to mention all the time screaming was utilised before the 70s, but that would take far too long, and also mean I would have to mention the Beatles, so let's move on to something that resembles the modern day usage. The early 70s would essentially see the invention of metal, with Black Sabbath doing this apparently, which started a 30-year-long rat race of bands continually trying to outdo each other on how unlistenable they can make their music. This obviously began in the 70s with bands beginning to experiment with harsher vocal techniques. A prominent example would be Venom, who actually went on to inspire a lot of what metal would become, all whilst looking as goofy as humanly possible. In relation to specifically vocals and screaming, Venom would utilise shouts, growls and grunts, probably just so his voice could be heard in the mix. The question is, if they are essentially the originators within metal, why did they decide to scream? I believe it has a lot to do with the imagery and actually links back to the 11th century play I spoke about earlier. Venom primarily featured satanic imagery, much like the play, and took a similar approach to the vocals. It seems the devil may have some sort of throat disease or something. This opened the floodgates for metal screaming. Before you could even blink, this dude was screaming, this dude was screaming, even this dude was doing his best attempt at a scream. 1983 would see Slayer introduce elements of harsher vocals into their music, although you could still understand what they were saying somewhat, so it doesn't really count. As death metal reared its stinky, greasy head, vocals became completely inaudible. The important and creatively named release Death by Metal would see constant harsh rasps and growls as opposed to screamed vocals being used as a temporary effect. Morbid Angel would progress death metal screaming with thunderous, squealing vocals. It wouldn't be until 1987 that death metal vocals would really come into their own, with the release of Scream Bloody Gore, with a constant flow of painful sounded screeches. And although this style of vocals would influence the screams of the future, Chuck Schuldiner vocals sound quite different from what is seen today in modern death metal. This is around the time Cannibal Corpse entered this pit of degeneracy, with a style of screaming that is not only extremely harsh, but completely unrecognisable in terms of being from the mouth of a human. Legend has it Chris Barnes saw one of the potential designs for a Cannibal Corpse album cover and immediately let out an intense growl of pure disgust, which was immediately recorded and used as vocals on the album. Barnes's vocals would somehow lower the pitch and add distortion, creating a rumbly growl that more so sounds like what you'd hear on a modern death metal album. I know that kind of sounds like it was done on the DAW, but somehow he was able to put effects on his own voice just by singing. Another distinctive screaming style that began in the 1980s is the black metal style, sounding more like an agonising shriek than a broken subwoofer. Bathory's Quathorn would opt for a more raspy style of screaming in 1984, producing vocals that were more abrasive than anything seen at the time, inspiring the black metal scene that would form in the years following. The black metal scream was designed to match the abrasive guitar tone and speed, with a human voice somehow sounding more disgusting than a guitar run through 3 cheap distortion pedals and recorded with a pilot's helmet. Around the same time, Amoebics were developing punk into even more of a heavily distorted mess than it already was. You might call it crusty, well you probably would call it crusty because it was known as crust punk. Amoebics' singer would either be a chain smoker or really want to sound like one. As opposed to being kind of theatrical, these vocals just sound like a typical argument you'd hear in a 24-hour McDonald's at 3 AM. Speaking of punk, prior to this point a lot of punk's aggression came from the instrumentation. Although there were rumblings of a little bit of screaming, and as the line between punk and metal has become a little bit blurry, the vocal styles have kind of mixed, with a lot of music inspired by punk nowadays featuring vocals that would sound more familiar on a death metal album from the 90s. This may seem like all fun and games, just being as loud as humanly possible for the sake of it, and although that may be the case, this technique can actually result in some serious health issues, such as throat and voice issues developing alongside occasional migraines. This has forced some musicians to quit the genre altogether. For example, Sonny Moore from the band From First to Last would be forced to retire from metal and would eventually become Skrillex, which brings me to the conclusion, if it wasn't for that stupid spider that Who was singing about, Call of Duty edits would have used Archangel by Burial as backing music instead of Skrillex, Butterfly Effect. That may make it sound like screaming is just a terrible idea, but if done with the proper technique, it's relatively harmless. It's the other things that metal musicians do that cause them real harm. I'll let you research how to safely scream yourself, ain't no way I'm somehow being responsible for some kid frying their vocal cords. Nowadays screaming is everywhere, and the conventions of each of the styles developed beforehand have kinda just melded together, making it almost impossible to make this video without pissing off a few people. Many modern hardcore bands have taken the more shouty, fast-paced style of punk vocals and delivered them in a way that incorporates screaming or growling. Black metal screeches have remained prevalent mainly within the genre of black metal as well as offshoots, however is occasionally used in songs that would probably instrumentally fit into a different genre. Death growls have just continued to sound more and more like a fart or a broken speaker as death metal has developed and splintered into different subgenres. There's too many examples to cover, and although it's a technique that is often looked down upon by individuals outside of the subculture, it remains a useful tool to not only express emotion, but signify changes in energy and aggression as songs develop. This is the time where most YouTubers will probably attempt some sort of scream for the viewers, and usually I'd say no, but today I'm feeling a little bit goofy, so I'm going to do one. Ready? Here we go. This is my attempt at a metal scream.